Hello, and welcome back to Planet Product Owner Video Edition. This is your host, Scott, checking out the readiness guidance today in this video. Do you need a definition of ready, and what is that? Let's talk about it for just a little bit because I've heard people toss this DOR thing around, kind of like a definition of done for the team's work. But what we're really talking about is a definition of ready, knowing whether or not our team could actually commit to what it is you're asking us to do. That's kind of what we're after here today. Uh, let's talk about reasons why we might have a definition of ready first. I'm going to go into that. And then, second, I'm going to bullet point some items in this video that I'm probably going to run through very quickly, but I'll speak to each one of them and kind of share my thoughts on why you would want to consider some of the points that I'm going to share with you today. I'm not going to cover all of them line by line because it's a lot, but like I said, you guys can go back and do a screenshot and talk through it. But for the ones that I don't get to today in this video. So without further ado, let's jump in. Do you need a definition of ready? So let's think about it in terms of why, right? Because I'm going to ask that. I'm going to ask why all the time. When I think of why we would need a definition of ready, I think in terms of, and again from experience, I'm thinking in terms of, okay, how would a definition of ready help us? Like, what could we possibly gain from having a definition of ready? I want you to start there because I don't want you to. I've never coached anybody on over processing something. All right. And we got to be very careful on the over processing of things. All right. So, in the over processing of things, we turn a definition of ready because we read it somewhere in some guide online that said, "Does your team have a definition of ready?" And you say, "No, I think we need a definition of ready." Well, we might not need a definition of ready. Okay. So, I'm going to give you some questions to ask, some questions to go through. And remember, this is routine stuff. Okay. These are things that you commonly see that might qualify you and your team for some kind of definition of ready. I'm going to talk about the definition of ready in the next slide after this one to give you guys some thinking patterns around what kind of content should be in the definition of ready when you think of it in these terms. And again, they're very high level and very loose, but I think it's enough art to get you going here, okay? To get you thinking about what it is you want to have and what you don't want to have. So let's jump in. So a few assessments here. Let's assess the situation first to determine whether or not we really need a definition of ready. And there's three or four categories that I could probably kind of break this down into. And we'll start with the first one here. Assess your scope of work and the goals behind the work. So when we think about that, what I mean is somebody's bringing you this idea or this solution or this capability or whatever it is. They're bringing it to you and your team because they have to have it done. Right? It's a priority for the entire world. The world's going to be on fire if we don't get this thing done. So, what is the thing that they're asking you to do? That's kind of what we're talking about here when we're assessing the scope of work and the goals. So, do you and your team routinely, that's the key word there, routinely struggle with the never ending story? It's like, what is it? When are we going to call this done? Is it ever going to get out the door? What is it that we're accomplishing, right? So, if you're struggling with the never ending story, then you could be a candidate for considering a definition of ready. Are you missing the end state of your initiatives? In other words, what is it that, when are we going to call this? Like, I'm not talking about done from a goal perspective. I'm talking about how are we going? What I'm talking about here is acceptance criteria, guys. What is their acceptance criteria that's solid enough to say, yeah, we can validate and test against the results of this when we are completed with it? That's what I'm talking about there. So if you're missing that, you're missing kind of the end state and how we're gonna know that we're proven that we are completed with our work. That's a little bit different than the never ending story. The never ending story is we're going to do this and we're going to do that and we're going to do that and we're going to do it. We're talking blue sky there, right? If it's always a blue sky, then what ends up happening in the blue sky initiative or feature, if the product manager is sending you that, if it is in fact a product manager, what happens with the never ending story or the blue sky factor there is that we never deliver it. It goes on and on and on. It's the song that never ends. And we don't want to be in the position where the song that never ends, right? We don't want to sing that. We've been on the youth trips. We don't want that anymore, right? So the end state of the initiative, though, if you're missing that, it's like, when do we actually call this done? When can we measure it? That's your acceptance criteria for the feature. So are metrics usually missing? Now, listen, don't misunderstand. Coach Scott did not say that because this feature 1 quarter ago had no metrics associated with it one time, that we're usually missing metric. That's not what I said. That does not constitute the need of a definition of ready. Because remember, we're in the business of discovering, exploring, and solving for the unknown. Okay. The problem with that is, though, is that we really kind of got to have more information to go on than just throwing something over the wall in the fence and saying, here you go. This is what we want you to do. I mean, that's kind of not fair to anybody. And what ends up happening is the team doesn't deliver the work. So the business says, well, that team sucks because they can't get anything out the door, while the team points back and says, well, the business never really qualifies what it is they're asking us to do in the first place. So how can they possibly say we don't ever deliver anything? They don't know what they want. Well, that's why we're in the business we're in. It's the collaboration piece of it that's missing a lot of times. So, does your team routinely not deliver the value to the customer? Now, that is the question. Are we now, product owners and team members? Hold on a minute. I didn't say that y'all weren't busy. I didn't say that you weren't actively working in your sprints. I didn't say that you weren't completing user stories or tasks. That's not what I said. I said, does your team routinely not deliver value to the customer? And that's totally different than completing user stories or working all the time or burning points. If we're not delivering value to the customer, it could be a sign that we're still not real clear on what it is we're wanting to do. Are we working on the right things? Okay, because you can do the things right all day long, but you may not still be working on the right thing. You may have the best quality of code in the history of programming, but you're not delivering the right thing. So if that's the case and we're routinely not delivering value to the customer, you could qualify for looking into a definition of ready for your team. It just shores up the whole thing. So that's the assessment of the scope of work and the goals piece. Now let's talk about your collaboration across the organization. There are a few things here that I'd like to maybe ask of you. So, do you often find that mock-ups are wildly imagined? Somebody over here in this other area put together a mock-up design, a UI draft, a UI design, and they sold it to everybody in the organization. They said, "This is what we're going to do next quarter, guys. Check this out. This is so cool. We got the blue snowflake that dances 3 times when you click on it." Whoa, we can't do that, man. Sits in front of two APIs. It's going to be a performance issue nightmare. We got security risks all over the place, and we don't have the data to build that. Whoa, nobody knew that part, right? So if you're routinely looking at wildly imagined mockups from external sources or even from your own, okay, it's important. So assess that collaboration there across your organization. What about this one? Do other teams send you definitions that are not quite hitting the mark, or do they expose additional risks? If you're routinely getting that, you could qualify for a definition of ready. Do other stakeholders routinely make promises that can't typically be met, either technically or functionally? So, what I'm saying there is they're asking you again to put that dancing blue snowflake up there that bounces 3 times when you click on it. We don't even have the snowflake, and we certainly don't have the ability to make it dance, right? So, if we can't do that, and then, it breaks business rules too, right? So, if we're routinely making promises up and out, that's what I call it, up and out. We're going up the channel, and then we're going outside of our channel to communicate and socialize these things. If that's what we're doing routinely and we're making those promises, then all we're doing is setting ourselves up for failure, team. Okay, we can't do that to each other. We might be able to look at a definition of ready to help us with that. What about enablers and deliverables from outside teams? Are those routinely mismanaged? Now, again, I didn't say, well, one time at band camp, that's not what I mean. I mean, is it routinely mismanaged for these enablers, capabilities, runway work, or those items, right? So if that's the case, we may look at this. And then finally, let's look at the level of involvement across the organization from third party vendors, and even involvement internally from external contributors to our team, right? Let's look at that and kind of make an assessment here. Do we struggle identifying the right sponsor or the stakeholder? Do we have multiple agendas that are routinely complicating the flow of work? And do we even know who our customer is? Ugh, I don't know. That's kind of scary, right? We don't know who our customer is and who's asking for it. Then why are we even in this, right? So, those are important questions for us to ask when we're assessing the level of involvement across the organization and with third party vendors. And finally, and this is the big one before we go to the next slide, Do you have more than three? Or I would actually even say maybe even three or more outside systems or teams that you continually rely on for your work to work. And when I say for your work to work, what I mean by that is you have a core system somewhere, then there's some kind of routine that runs on top of that. Then you have a different group who's handling the integration. Then you have somebody else handling the presentation. Then you got somebody else doing the reporting and somebody else that's handling the all right. So if you got three or more, where three or more are gathered, you might have to look at a definition already because you're going to take so many hops right there that managing those dependencies and those enablers is really going to become too much of a trick for you to make sure that you're hitting the mark and delivering that value you want to in the interval. So, enough of that. Let's talk about the definition of readiness, or DOR as you read it online a lot. Readiness guidance for proposed work. Now, this is a draft. This is a sample version of it. And again, it doesn't have to be 14 pages long. And please don't overprocess this. I have preached to you guys over the past 5 years of the podcast to not overprocess things, right? When I think of a definition of readiness, I think of I'm kind of equating this to a definition of done prior to a team committing to it. In other words, we understand roughly 80% of what's going to be needed, who's going to be needed, what the risks are, how we're going to be measured, and when we're going to be done with it, right? Or what it's going to take to get it done. So when we think of that from a program or a product management standpoint, and we think about this definition of ready, I want to just give you a few thinking patterns, and there's some categories here that we'll walk through. And again, I'm not going to go into every single one of them. I might, who knows? Business value statement and metrics. So we do want to make sure that we're understanding what the business value is, or the customer value even is, and what kind of metrics that we're looking to move here, because we want to move a needle left, up or down, right? With whatever work we're trying to do here. So, do we have KPIs and metrics associated with this feature in this epic? Yes? No? If we don't have them, can we get them in there? Right? Before you ask me to do this thing, I really need to understand the metrics and the value statement that you're proposing here. Do you have a value story? In other words, can you humanize this? Can you tell me that Miss Betty, uh, who stands in line, at Walgreens trying to get her prescriptions filled, what is it that she needs in her hand right now? Right? What is the value story? What is the humanized value story for this body of work? If you don't have that, maybe we're missing that. And if we're missing that, then we're not real sure why we're doing what we're doing. And that leads to not really knowing what we're doing. Right. So, uh, now the scope of the feature tied to an epic, sometimes there are standalone features, and that's totally fair. I mean, we can totally do that all day long. We can do standalone features from here to Sunday. But the thing is that if we do have features that are tied to strategic themes, make sure they are tied to them before we start the work, before we commit to the work. Because if we don't, we're going to be scattered and we may be doing something that other functional architectural items are satisfying. Or maybe we need to report up to some other program or some other product, right? So if we're not creating that tie between them, in other words, linking them, right, then maybe we're missing something, and we can handle that right up front. We can take care of all of that stuff up front while we're in the ideate and elaborate stage of the agile lifecycle development. Can it be completed within your interval? That's important. We want to be able to do that because we're trying to deliver to our customers to get frequent feedback and to solve their need and to get value into their hands quickly. So, can we get that within our interval? So, those are some of those questions that we want to talk about business value statements and metrics. The next category here is the functional seed stories for major scenarios and flows. Now, I'll do another workshop and another video on that, and I'll also, by the way, at the top of the screen here, wherever it is, top of the screen about the definition of done. I'm gonna that's gonna be a quick follow up here, a fast follower to this video. Functional seed stories are created. So this is what we're talking about here. The draft wireframes, right? So if you've got a team that's creating your mock-up designs, your UI experience, your flow, and all of that stuff, do me a favor, put the word draft on front of that, Because what happens is somebody gets a hold of that and they're looking at it today and they go out to other sponsors and other stakeholders and other organizational influencers right throughout the organization. And what ends up happening is we've already sold them the goods. We've sold them the product that we're going to have the dancing blue snowflake on the screen that bounces 3 times when we click on it. We may not be able to technically do that, right? So let's make sure we're marking that as draft. These high level scenarios with preconditions, actors, and outcomes, and I'm hoping that we're qualifying those actors. I'm going to buzz through a few of these. Some of these things are needed, some of these things are not. Again, it depends on how complicated or complex your work is, right? So, sequence diagrams, workflows, or any documentation, that should be attached to the feature or referenced there as an appendix or something, right? And then, do we have any fast followers? Have we elaborated this to the point where we found, okay, we can split this feature. Now we're going to actually create the fast follower and write it, document it, author it, right? And get that thing plugged in there so that we'll know that we have some options now going forward. If we test this and it works fine and everybody's happy and we're meeting the need and the customers are satisfied and we're in good shape, we may not need that fast follower, right? We may not even need that second level story or third level story. No problem there. But the point is in the exercise is making sure that we're going ahead and doing this fast follower because somebody somewhere sometime is going to say, why didn't we get the blue sky? Why didn't we get the blue sky scenario? Well, the fact of the matter is you don't get the blue sky scenario because either A, the customer doesn't need it, or B, it's really not a priority. That's it. I mean, that's it. It's either you didn't get it prioritized or customers were happy. You didn't really need it. So we run around all the time chasing blue sky, which goes back to the previous slide about the never ending story. So let's make sure that we're documenting those and tying them together here. Now, let's look at some of the other areas because these are some of the high level areas that are inputs, I think, to the feature work or the solutions that they're asking us to build. Enablement, capability type stories, runway work, right? Let's go ahead and create those tasks. Let's make sure we go ahead and get those things documented and outlined. And you know what? It's not just enough to like document an inventory kind of thing or visualize it and put it into a backlog somewhere. Let's assign it. If it looks like it's getting traction and priority, let's assign that because these guys are going to come up to you in 3 weeks from now in PI planning or in your development initiative planning or your quarterly planning or whatever it is that you're doing, right? And they're going to say, wait, we got to have this. And so we need you to commit to it in the next quarter or the next interval. Well, let's go ahead and make sure that these other folks are aware because it could sit in their backlog unassigned. Talk with the team. You're not assigning it to them, product owner. But as long as you're collaborating and you're getting your scrum master to help you with these things, then at least we're putting it on their radar so that we know that these things are coming, right? Let's plan ahead. We don't plan in Agile. Remember, we don't plan in Agile. So offense and dependencies chart, that's another thing that could be helpful in a definition of ready. When we talk about that, we're talking about predecessors and dependencies and outside things and some kind of linear visual planning board, like a program Kanban board or something, right? I mean, those are things that could certainly help us out. And if you don't know what I just said, um, maybe one of these days I'll do a safe video for you and do some training on that. So, centers of influence. This is a big one because a lot of times somebody authors the work and okay, product managers don't get offended when I say this. We know you're good at what you do. Okay. We trust your judgment, but we also know that it takes more than just you to pull this thing off. So you don't have to be so prideful in authoring this thing all alone and don't give anybody else any access to any vendors or any solution managers or any architectural folks or whatever it is. Okay. If it's a consultant that you're dealing with from the third party, maybe you're the primary point of contact, but go ahead and put their names in there so we know from the team level who we're dealing with and what their role is. That's just not a bad idea, right? So, a lot of these things are going to help you eliminate or reduce some of the struggles that we talked about on the previous slide, which you can go back and check out in a minute. I'm going to land this plane here. So, when we are talking about the definition of ready, again, it doesn't have to be 14 pages long, and you don't have to take all of the things that I mentioned on the previous slide. You don't have to take any of those. What I do want you to do, though, is assess what kind of disconnects you're having if you are not routinely delivering value to your customers. Assess if you are overcommitting to the feature work that you and your team are trying to pull off, right, in this next coming interval. And if you're routinely struggling with those things, then perhaps a definition of ready is something that's in your future. right? So think through some of those thinking patterns and try to figure out what's agreeable for everybody, right? And let's see if we can make that happen, right? It may help you out. Some of the thinking patterns in there are good ones to consider. Don't make it my work. Don't make my work your work, and don't make your work my work. You could make my work your work. I mean, I've already been there and done that. So 80% of these things probably work out for you just fine. But don't take my word for it. Go to the team, collaborate with the team, make sure that the team understands, you know, do we need it? And please don't just put in a 14-page definition of ready just because some website said to do it, that it would be helpful. It may not help you at all. Okay. So really assess where it is that you're doing. This is inspect and adapt. So make sure that you're inspecting and adapting your processes and your work, whatever it is to make you better. Because remember, Scott's definition of agile is learning new ways to work better. That's it. Okay. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Until next time, have a safe and fun lean journey, my friends.